My name is Jose Barriga. I am a native from Bolivia, but I study in the Minnesota State University in Mankato. I have to thank, before I begin this presentation, the National Science Foundation for funding for this project. I also have to thank the College of Science, Engineering and Technology, as well as the Honors Program, and the National Collegiate of Honors Council for making this possible. And finally, the Society of Ethnobiology for this opportunity for me to present. So as you can see the title, I looked at the indigenous and Western medical practices in the Peruvian Amazon. So just to give you a background, as you know, the Amazon Basin is a territory that covers about over 40% of South America. This is a floristically mega diverse area of the world with a huge amount of ethnic groups, a huge amount of rivers and practices of natural medicine. Before I go any further, I want to show you, this is the Peruvian territory, and I concentrated in the northeastern region of Peru, around the city of Iquitos. Iquitos is a city of about 500,000 people, and since it has no access to any other city by road, it kept growing on its own with a lot of influence from the communities around it. So as I was going through the literature to prepare myself for this project last year, I realized that this area, according to John Hemming, attracted the attention of scientists even before the rubber boom of the 1800s. Actually, the first foreigner scientists who looked at the use of medicinal plants happened in 1818. This is Johann von Baptist and Friedrich von Martius, both German from Bavaria. They collected about 2,300 species of plants that they took back to Germany to study under laboratory settings. Also, John Kriecher believes that every community, every ethnic group in the Amazon has one revered individual, one person that everybody respects because they hold the knowledge on how to use medicinal plants, and also they are the connection with the supernatural world. They're also known as the shamans. Other authors, including Alexiades and Lacasse, believe that in the past couple of decades, there's been a lot more missionary efforts, both religious and educational efforts. And they believe that those institutions or missions have had a negative effect on the knowledge on medicinal plants. And everybody knows as well in the area that the use of medicinal plants, it's not mainly for healthcare, because it also involves stories, songs, and it's a very important part of the identity of the different ethnic groups that live in this area. So, as we know, there is a diminution of knowledge because of the several factors that I described, which leads to the fact that there are less shamans, less revered individuals in the communities. Also that educational and religious efforts in the area tend to reduce the importance of the traditional knowledge. And the use of the pharmaceuticals, because of the same factors, is increasing. According to John Hemming, any ethnic group in the Amazon will readily use pharmaceuticals if they have access to them. So this led me to ask a couple of questions. And before I went to the region between December and January, about 4 months ago, I wanted to know if this knowledge is still revered to those individuals, or if the knowledge is more widespread, knowing that there are less shamans. Also, I wanted to know if this knowledge actually plays an important role in the cultural identity of the people. And finally, I wanted to know if religious and educational efforts are actually having this negative effect on the knowledge and the reducing of the natural medicine. So if we go back to the Amazon map, and like I said, we're concentrating in the northeastern Peruvian area around Iquitos. So I started in Iquitos, where I interviewed a few scientists, Peruvian scientists, and also I went to two research institutions that look at the ethnobotany of the area. And then I took a boat trip to get to the area of my research. It was a fairly long boat trip, it took about 24 hours. And then I finally got to the Orosa River area near the town of Yanashi, where I conducted the research in 3 different communities. So the participants in the communities were mainly heads of households. Comandancia was the only community that was mainly a native group. They were the Yagua group, and it was the biggest of the communities that I worked on. The average age of the informants was 48. I was able to interview 8 households there. Nuevo Israel, which is a little farther down the river, about the same number of households, and then Santo Tomas. All 3 communities that I worked on, they're fairly new communities. The oldest Comandancia is only 50 years old. And those are communities that started after some period where people were working for the landowners. And then they decided to settle their own villages and communities. Nuevo Israel is one of the religious communities. It's a religion that derived from Catholicism. Although they consider themselves Catholics, almost everybody considers themselves Catholics in all 3 communities. None of the families really practice because they don't have access to a church or a priest. But that didn't seem to have a negative effect or any effect on the use of medicinal plants. Here we have a picture of Dolores, one of the moms in Nuevo Israel, with 2 of her children. So what I did is that I formulated semi-structured interviews, and I randomly went all over the communities looking for households, looking for heads of households that would be available to answer questions. Most of the people that I interviewed were open to the questions. They didn't seem to have constraints, giving up the information they had, or time constraints. They were very open. And I looked mainly at the preference they had, meaning if there was a health issue, what would be the first thing they would do? Would they look for plants, or would they look for pharmaceuticals? Also, what was the dependability on the shaman, or again, on the revered individual? And then finally, whether that played a cultural role for them. So what I found was that the majority of the households in all 3 communities would go and seek medicinal plants as a first method, as a first step to treat a health problem. Also, only one of the communities had a number of, again, on the right side here we have the population number that I interviewed, so you have an idea. Only Nuevo Israel, that was the only community that had a shaman. The other 2 communities did not have a shaman, but they all had this preference for medicinal plants. And then finally, every household that I interviewed believed that having the knowledge of medicinal plants was important for their culture, not only as ribereño, or a person that lives near the river, but also as part of the community where they lived, whether they were Yagua, this ethnic group, or Mestizo, as the other two communities. So this led me to conclude that the preference on medicinal plants depends mainly on the access that they have on the medicinal plants. Since they live very close to the river, it's an area that floods a lot, so they don't have all the access they would wish to medicinal plants. And then I saw a convenient syncretism, and I'm going to hold that thought and develop it in a little bit. And then also that the traditional medicine is a very important part of the cultural identity of the people in this region of the Amazon. Almost every parent that I interviewed believed that it was important for their children to know how to use medicinal plants, not only to prepare for bad economic times, but also to be able to have access to things they would readily have around their homes. So I mentioned something about this favorable syncretism. And what I mean by syncretism is that most of the people said that if it was something mild, a mild health condition, like a headache or a toothache or a fever or a diarrhea, then they would go and look for a plant. What was interesting is that no family had a management program to grow the plants around their homes. They all knew a few number of plants that they could use, but they would all go look for it in the wild. But if it was something more severe, like this family that I encountered, who they had a 6-month-old baby that had bronchitis. And so they said they used medicinal plants for about 4 days, and it only got worse. So they finally decided to hop in their canoe, ride for over 2 hours to get to the closest clinic, where they would get some help from pharmaceuticals. So that's what I meant by syncretism. Now, I mentioned that religious and educational efforts had a negative effect on the knowledge. Well, what I found was that in those 3 communities, that wasn't the case. In Santo Tomas, which I mentioned was one of the most religious communities that I visited, one of the leaders of this community, religious group in Santo Tomas said, God made the plants, so there's nothing wrong with me using them. And they thought it was important to be in that connection with nature. And also about the educational institutions, although the majority of the people, they only had the highest level of education was 6th grade. There was only a few cases where they could go to secondary school in a different area. And that was the case of Aldo Ramirez, one of my youngest informants. And he was finishing high school, and he planned on being a lawyer in the future. And he also thought that it was important for him to learn how to use medicinal plants because this knowledge came from his ancestors, from his grandparents, and he thought it was important for him to know that. So that wasn't the case in those 3 communities. And finally, just as ideas, if I were to do this project in the future again, I would try to look at maybe more communities and see the interaction there is between them. I was able to see that in different communities, they may have different uses for the same plant. And actually, one of the informants in the Yagua community said that he thought it was important for there to be a sort of symposium where they could share the knowledge they have on different plants. I would also look at a characterization of the products they use, both medicinal plants and pharmaceuticals. I noticed that there is a high need for antibiotics in the area. due to infections and things that occur naturally in the area. And then also at the economic factors, most families have a piece of land where they grow manioc, where they grow plantains, but also most of them, the fathers, they go hunting, and also they trade the things they produce for other things that they can't easily get. So I would like to end with a quote by one of the Peruvian scientists that I interviewed in Iquitos. And she said that medicinal plant knowledge must contribute to solve the health problems of the least favored population, unjustly labeled primitive. That's all I have, so if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying within time, because we do have time for some questions.
Good. Yes?
Do you have any sense of how representative the communities you worked with were to other places up and down the river?
Well, I had a fairly small number of like families that I interviewed. Now those are smaller communities, and Nuevo Israel and Santo Tomás, a lot of the people travel back and forth between their communities and Iquitos, and that's how they get their ibuprofen and their antibiotics. So I don't think it's representative for the Peruvian Amazon in general. I wouldn't say that, and that's why I said I would need to go to more communities to do that. Any other question?
Quote, my favorite ethnobiological quote. Somebody was working